From Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Duquesne University and Duquesne University Athletics presents The Rooney Rule and What's Next? Equity and Access in Athletics and Beyond. Co-sponsored by the Atlantic 10 Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion.
Good afternoon. My name is Bernadette McGlade, Commissioner of the Atlantic 10 Conference, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you today for participating in this symposium on the Rooney Rule and What's Next? Access and Equity in Intercollegiate Athletics. I would like to thank Duquesne University and Duquesne's Department of Intercollegiate Athletics, President Ken Gormley and Athletic Director Dave Harper. I also have to thank Jim Rooney and Jeremi Duru for participating today and sharing your experience and expertise with all. Today's discussion on the Rooney Rule is the first in a series of events that will be co-sponsored by the A10's Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. The commission is co-chaired by President Gormley and Athletic Director Brian Baptiste from Salle University, and it will allow the A10 to collectively effect positive change in the area of social justice and equity for all. So thank you both for moderating. In addition, I would like to encourage all of you participating to ask questions and to fully engage in this symposium. I thank you for participating, and I also thank you for caring.
Thank you, Commissioner McGlade, and good afternoon. I'm Ken Gormley, President of Duquesne University. As Commissioner McGlade just mentioned, the A10 recently announced the creation of the Commission on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I'm extremely proud to serve as the Commission's co-chair, along with Brian Baptiste, who's Athletic Director from Salle University. This initiative marks a crucial step forward as we work to ensure that our sports teams and staffs, our A10 campuses, and society as a whole foster an increased respect for diversity and together work to combat systemic racism. This is a very special collaboration. The A10 is one of the most prominent athletic conferences in the United States. It consists of 14 members: Davidson College, the University of Dayton, Duquesne University, Fordham University, George Mason University, the George Washington University, LaSalle University, the University of Massachusetts, the University of Rhode Island, University of Richmond, St. Bonaventure University, St. Joseph's University, St. Louis University, and Virginia Commonwealth University. Today's inaugural symposium kicks off a series of conversations that we hope will be hosted by this new commission for the entire community that makes up this impressive group of institutions that make up the A10. And this symposium is not just for athletes, it's for the entire university community at each institution because we all share a common bond. We hope it will be a model for other conferences in the United States. And today we're thrilled to host a discussion about the historic origins, impact, and potential future promise of the Rooney Rule. Duquesne University is the ideal place to have this conversation because the Rooney Rule is named after Dan Rooney, one of Duquesne's most distinguished alums, former owner of the hometown Pittsburgh Steelers, iconic figure in the world of professional sports, and later ambassador to Ireland, appointed by President Barack Obama. The Rooney family has been the majority owner and operator of the Steelers since the formation of the franchise in 1933. In the 1960s and 70s, Dan Rooney transformed the team into one of the NFL's greatest dynasties, a Super Bowl legend that remains among the most popular franchises in the game. A powerful voice in the NFL for decades, Dan Rooney fought to give more opportunities for minority coaches to rise up and succeed in the NFL. The resulting Rooney Rule was put into play by the National Football League 17 years ago in 2003. It tackled pervasive issues of racism within the league, requiring that a diverse slate of candidates be considered when hiring a head coach and general manager. In Dan Rooney's own organization, it led to the hiring of Steeler head coach Mike Tomlin in 2007, who has gone on to establish his own impressive record in professional sports. The Rooney Rule was visionary and transformational at the time it was created. Over the years, it's inspired other industries to follow suit, even outside athletics as well. Dan Rooney was elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2000, and though we mourned his passing in 2017, his great work has been carried on by his eldest son, Art Rooney II, current president of the Steelers and a Duquesne Law alum, and more recently by his youngest son, Jim Rooney, who has memorialized his father's work in his new best-selling book, A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's Story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. We're honored to have Jim Rooney here with us for this inaugural A10 program to reflect on his dad's legacy and the impact of the Rooney Rule, past, present, and future. A renowned speaker, Jim is co-partner of Rooney Consulting, which assists organizations with enhancing culture, building strong teams, and growing businesses. He's also the founder of FirstLink Research and Analytics, a world leader in building the business case for technology transition. Joining Jim today is one of the nation's foremost sports law experts, Jeremi Duru, professor of law at American University. Professor Duru is a graduate of Harvard Law School, a frequent commentator in national media, and counsel to the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which champions diversity in the NFL and which is named after the first black head coach in the NFL, Frederick Douglass Fritz Pollard. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Rooney and Professor Jeremi Duru.
Ken, great to be with you.
Wonderful to see you, and you too, Jeremi.
Yes, it's an honor. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So thanks so much for being here with us today to talk a little bit about this subject, the Rooney Rule. How it was a groundbreaker in sports and more broadly in other fields, and the impact it continues to have today. So that's how we're going to start out, and then we'll reserve at least 20 minutes, maybe more, for Q&A from our virtual audience. And for that part, I will be joined by my commission co-chair, Brian Baptiste, who is the AD from Salle University. So let's get started, and Jim, we'll start with you. And I want to begin with the big picture, Jim. Why do you believe sports is a good venue and model for having honest and respectful conversations about equity, opportunity, and race?
Well, Ken, it's wonderful to be with you and everyone at the A10. Duquesne University is certainly close to our heart, but all of your members are fantastic institutions, and so it's wonderful to have this conversation amongst you folks. So we talk about sports because I think sports is one place where we all see folks from all different backgrounds, races, cultures, experiences, doing things together on teams. They're collaborating, they're doing teamwork, they're accomplishing goals together. And also, when we create a level playing field, we see that you can have conflict like we do during games, and that conflict can be resolved in a way that we all agree that the result is fair and that folks can say, hey, this accomplishment was worthwhile. Unfortunately, when you look at the decision-making capacity for so many of the organizations that lead the sports world, coaches, general managers, et cetera, you still have very little minority participation. When you look at the NFL, for example, you have 70% of the players are minority, but you have less than 5 NFL head coaches or minority coaches at this point. So that's a place where we think anyone with any sort of common sense would look at that and say, that just doesn't make sense. So that's where we always begin the conversation. And then where Jeremi and I really spend a lot of time in this conversation is on two fronts. One is the processes and procedures. We talk specifically about the Rooney Rule as an example of a process, which I'll let Jeremi, the lawyer, lead that part of the conversation. But then the second, Ken, is what you really talked about is people, and I use my father, Dan Rooney, as an example. So if you look at what my father did, he did three things. One, he had a definitive plan. Two, he listened to voices that were different than his own. And three, he was invested in execution. So in terms of having a definitive plan, my father, like most businesses, had a business plan that he started back in the late 50s into the 1960s when he was first getting out of Duquesne University. He built this business plan for the Steelers, and he talked about, he wanted us to be one of the most highly integrated teams in professional sports. The second thing he did is there was a writer from one of the largest, most highly circulated African American papers in the America called, his name was Bill Nunn. And Bill criticized the Steelers. He said they're not doing a good enough job when it comes to what we now call diversity hiring. And he spelled out why. My father invited Bill to lunch, and Bill went through his criticisms. Instead of my father getting defensive or backing away, he hired Bill on the spot. And then finally, when we talk about execution, once Bill came on board, Coach Knoll, who my father hired as our head coach, and my father, all were invested in creating this highly integrated team. And from 1968 to 1980, the Steelers drafted more players from the historically black colleges and universities than any other team. That team goes on to win 4 Super Bowl championships in 6 years. So it demonstrated not only was it the right thing to do, which my father believed, but it created a competitive advantage. So, when I look at these 3 aspects of what a person can do, having a definitive plan, listening to voices and criticism that might change our viewpoint, and then finally, being committed to execution, we can all do that. We don't have to create something as large as the Rooney Rule to be able to have an impact in those 3 aspects of how we approach diversity.
Thanks, Jim. And Jeremy, let me ask you this, because Jim just alluded to it. We know that initiatives often don't get beyond the concept stage without the right processes and procedures in place to move an idea forward. You're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. Processes and procedures are everything behind the scenes, really. And so could you talk a little bit about how these processes and procedures are particularly crucial in college and professional sports, especially in today's world?
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about kind of the process, the procedure that got us from conception to implementation, and then also talk about kind of the forces that led to the push outside of the league that was in many ways the mirror image of what Dan Rooney was doing inside of the league. So notwithstanding all the work that Dan Rooney was doing, he put together extraordinary Steelers organization. Jim is modest about his father's accomplishments, so he may not have said it. I will say it. Dan Rooney had extraordinary influence within the league, among the league's owners, just because of his personality, his integrity, and his knowledge of the league and of the game. And so he worked hard to get folks to buy into the idea that we need to look beyond the pools of talent that we see right in front of us so that we might be used to. And so while he was doing that inside the league, there was a movement being born outside that league and outside the league. And the movement really took root after the 2001 season. After that season, Tony Dungy, current Hall of Famer, and Dennis Green, one of the greatest head coaches for the Minnesota Vikings, were both terminated within 2 weeks of each other. And it really caused a commotion in the NFL, but also outside of the NFL. And it got a couple of lawyers worked up. And these lawyers had spent a lot of time thinking about equal opportunity in employment in all sorts of industries, Johnson & Johnson, Coca-Cola, Texaco. They had cases with these companies. And they thought what they saw in the NFL was essentially employment discrimination against black coaches. After those 2 coaches, Coach Dungy and Coach Green, were fired, we were left with 1 black head coach out of 32 total opportunities in a league that, as Jim mentioned, was 70% African American. And so this really got under the collar of these lawyers. And so they put together a report. They commissioned a study from the University of Pennsylvania, peer-reviewed, statistically significant study, seeking to figure out over the previous 15 years, from 2001, going back 15 years to 1986, how the head coaches in the league by race had done with respect to win-loss records. And astoundingly, even to those who hypothesized that there was some discrimination going on, those 2 lawyers, astoundingly, Black head coaches won in their first year as a head coach 2.7 more games per season than white head coaches. So almost 3 more games per season in a 16-game season than white head coaches. In the year in which they were terminated, almost 1.5 more games on average than white coaches. They were simply having more success. And the conclusion to be drawn from the study was not that somehow Black coaches or coaches of color are inherently or innately better coaches. The conclusion was that these coaches of color had been essentially forced into continued apprentice roles as assistants for so long that when they finally got an opportunity, they just were better because they were more experienced and had more expertise. And so the lawyers took this study, wrapped around it a number of anecdotes about the careers of Dungy and Green and others, and essentially confronted the league with it. And when they confronted the league with it, they did so with an eye toward progress, with an eye toward a resolution. And the idea that they had was an idea that they had instituted in some of their settlement agreements with companies and their employment discrimination practices. And it's an idea similar to the one that Dan Rooney was working with inside the league. And the idea is that if you, among those who are contemplating for a position, if you interview or contemplate or meaningfully consider a broad, diverse group, you are more likely to get better outcomes. And so the lawyers came with the study, came with this idea, which Dan Rooney had been championing inside of the league, which they didn't know, and came to the commissioner, Paul Tagliabue, and said something's got to be done. Tagliabue and his general counsel, Jeff Pash, who's still the general counsel of the league, to their credit, they didn't grow defensive. They didn't demand, that we're going to fight this thing in court and kill you with 1,000 cuts because we're the stronger entity, the more capitalized entity. Rather, they looked at the report and at the ideas, and they said, you know what, we need to think about this stuff. And not only do we need to think about this stuff, but we have somebody in the league who's been thinking about it. And so Paul Tagliabue put together a workplace diversity committee to really explore what these lawyers were complaining about, and then more generally, the import of diversity. And to chair the committee, Paul Tagliabue tapped Dan Rooney, and Dan Rooney accepted. It was the sort of work that he loved to do, as Jim has mentioned. And when word of that got out to these lawyers and the half dozen or so former African-American players and executives who had joined with the lawyers in pushing for equal opportunity among coaches, when word got out to them, one of those former executives, a gentleman named John Wooten, one of the most respected African-American former executives in the game, alive today, John said, you know what, guys, we've won. And what he was saying was, we have Dan Rooney's attention to this issue on the inside. With us pushing from the outside, we're going to win. And that set in motion what became the Rooney Rule, this idea that when you are interviewing for a head coach and later for a general manager, you have to interview at least one candidate of color meaningfully to discharge the obligation.
Yeah, what a great story, Jeremy. And incidentally, Jeff Pash is one of my law school classmates, a really great guy. So it's good to hear that story. And what a great story for college athletes and athletic directors and others to hear. You know, process sounds boring to us, but actually it is a crucial way to, it's how you level the playing field, right? Is to have the right processes and procedures in place. It's a secret that a lot of times people don't focus on. So I think it's a very important lesson. And Jim, let me just say, Jeremy just used that phrase, "We have won," in describing the feeling many folks had when your dad was put in charge of the NFL's diversity initiative. So do you believe that the diversity initiative was, quote, won when your father was selected to lead that effort?
Well, I think it was an important piece, and it goes back to what I said before about listening to voices that were different than yours. As Jeremy said, John Wooten and the folks involved in that team, they were on the outside and they were pushing the league. They were pushing Dan Rooney to do a better job. But my father, again, like he did with Bill Nunn, welcomed the criticism and really built this partnership with John that was built on mutual respect. They knew at times they were going to have different points of view, but because they had that strong mutual respect, for the next 15 years, they really pushed the envelope better than anyone had, certainly in the NFL, and in many cases throughout most diversity initiatives. And so you saw a 300% increase in terms of the minority coaches hired. You saw a similar number when it comes to general managers. 10 of those folks have taken their team to the Super Bowl, which is the ultimate goal of anyone in the football operation side of the NFL. You have a total now of 40% of the total assistant coaching base are minorities since the Rooney Rule, and 25% of the on-field game officials, and that includes women. Now we have a small number of women coaches. That's gonna be growing, but in terms of the on-field game officials, that's been growing for a number of years now. So you saw a significant amount of change and upward trajectory, and it was because John Wooten and Dan Rooney were willing to show that mutual respect, to be advocates and champions, to get into, the other term I used was execution. When a job opening was available, Dan Rooney and John Wooten made sure that whoever was making the hiring decision, they were familiar with who all the candidates were. They were familiar with the process, that they were putting pressure on, in my father's case, owners, and in John's case, using the media and other tools that he had to make sure that this wasn't just, sort of a paper champion idea, but that it was really, that there was real weight behind it. So, that got us kicked off really well, to use a football term. But unfortunately, we're back to just being slightly above the numbers we had in 2003. And I know my father would be upset with these numbers. I know that we have to do some things. Some things have been done to improve it. And I'll let Jeremy talk about the more recent improvements to the rule. But make no mistake, this backslide is a problem, and my father would see it as that. Now, I think when we look at how do we go forward, where do we go from here? I do think it's important to look at what Dan and John and their groups did together and separately to put this process in place and find out what worked well. I don't think we should just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I also think we need a hard critical assessment of why we did slide backwards, and are those elements going to affect the NFL, but as importantly, are they going to affect the other industries that have embraced the Rooney Rule?
Okay, Jim, and that's a perfect segue to where I want to go next, and that is talking about how you move forward. And I hope, incidentally, we can talk about this a lot in the Q&A session, because I know from talking to a bunch of the ADs from the A10 school that they really want to focus on and have ideas about how we take this thing forward. But so, Jeremy, where do you see it? You've spent your career looking at all of this, and we're at a moment in our history. Where do we go from here? What next steps do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives should take, especially in the current climate here in the United States, to be effective? And why are the stakes even higher than ever before?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So, your last piece first. I mean, the stakes are higher than they've ever been because the nation is in a point where it's certainly not been in my lifetime. I have to say, I think I'm among the younger people on this panel. I can't say sure I think I am, but I suspect that there haven't been too many points in history, in anyone's lifetime in this room, that have been more fraught than this one. So the stakes are incredibly high. In terms of where we go from here, I mean, I think there are a few things. I agree with Jim that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Rooney Rule has been less effective in recent years. I think for a few reasons. I think one reason is that I believe the NFL has not enforced it in the way that it once did and that it should have over the course of the last few years in a few different instances. I think that the Rooney Rule has required some adjustment over the years, and that hasn't been done until this past spring. This past spring, I should point out that the league now requires going forward, and we'll see how this is implemented in the hiring season that will come after this season, but the league requires now that there be quote unquote 2 people of color in the pool. So if you're looking for a head coach or a general manager, you have to interview more than 1 person of color. You have to interview at least 2 people of color. And that follows a lot of statistical analysis out of the Harvard Business Review and elsewhere, that if you have 2 in the pool, you're much more likely to result in a situation where those 2 are seriously considered, and you get a hire that is of color. The NFL also extended the Rooney Rule to the coordinators, the idea being let's move it one level down in terms of the hierarchy. So now if you're looking for an offensive coordinator or a defensive coordinator or a special teams coordinator, you have to implement the Rooney Rule. So the NFL is trying to strengthen the rule to meet the challenges of the day. And we'll find out in a few months how that comes to pass. I think in terms of moving forward, Jim mentioned other industries in which the Rooney Rule has gotten some traction. And he's right about that. I mean, Silicon Valley for sure, Facebook, Pinterest, they've got forms of the Rooney Rule. Intel, Xerox have forms of the Rooney Rule. Wells Fargo has a form now, just a few months ago, instituted of the Rooney Rule. Public entities, the state of Oregon's got a Rooney Rule. If you're looking for an athletic director or a head coach in any sport, the state legislature says you have to interview a person of color. The city of Pittsburgh has a form of the Rooney Rule. The city of Portland, Oregon does. We know on the Democratic side of the House and Senate, there's a Rooney Rule that applies for congressperson or a House member or a senator is looking for a new member of that person's staff. They've got to interview a person of color or a woman. So we see traction in so many places. And one of the keys in my view, is that these entities look at what's happened in the NFL. In the early days, success. In more recent days, less success. And what's the reason for that? That these entities take the lessons, some of the lessons that I'm hoping we'll be able to converse about as we move forward in this conversation over the course of the next hour, but take the lessons that are learned and implement them such that the Rooney Rule can be more effective in those other contexts. And finally, while we certainly don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, we also need other babies. So the Rooney Rule has been effective, at least early on in the league. I think the concept behind the Rooney Rule, that we want people to sit down together and talk about things of mutual interest, and that will impact decision-making. I think that's a valuable and important concept, excuse me. But we all have to think about other initiatives. Maybe one thing the NFL didn't do as well as it could have is continually think about other initiatives over the past 17 years, in addition to what was once a brand new innovation of the Rooney Rule. I think all of us in this conversation, all of us throughout the country, have to be open to, have to think about other means of convincing people who are making decisions that diversity is important value, that treating everybody with respect and casting a broad net for candidates is critical not only to what is right, but also to what is best in the business interests of the entity making the decision. And that for us to move forward in these fraught times, Ken, we have to come together and think about how all of us working together can be more effective than all of us working separately.
Well, thanks, Jim and Jeremy, for that great discussion. So now it's time to turn to some audience questions. And joining us for this portion of the program, as I promised, I'd like to welcome my co-chair on the A10 Commission on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Mr. Brian Baptiste, who's the athletic director at Salle University. It's great to have you with us here today, Brian.
Thanks, President Gormley. It's been wonderful working on this A10 Commission initiative. I think when you look at the enthusiasm that we've seen amongst our 14 member institutions, I think it's great, and we're fortunate enough to be able to have the perspective of Jim and Jeremy and their insight for us to be able to learn lessons. And it gives us a tremendous opportunity to go back and think about how do we develop meaningful and impactful solutions, especially as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I couldn't be more excited for the symposium.
Thanks, Brian, and it's an honor to serve with you as co-chair on this important initiative. So in this segment, we're going to get to those joining us by live stream. There's hundreds of people watching us today. I know that you have questions for our special guests, so please submit your questions by clicking on the link that appears on your YouTube page wherever you're viewing this program. But first, I'm going to turn the floor over to my co-chair, Brian Baptiste, to lead it off with the first question. Brian, it's yours.
So my first question is for Jim Rooney. So Jim, as you pointed out earlier, even with your father's forward-thinking vision in adopting the Rooney Rule and hiring head coach Mike Tomlin, it hasn't been immune to criticism, right? Many people view the results as being disappointing. You think presently the NFL only has 4 minority head coaches, 2 minority general managers. How would you assess the league's progress since the advent of the Rooney Rule? And then I'll just throw in another layer to that question. Is there a better way to make sure organizations are acting in good faith and actually following the parameters of the Rooney Rule?
Brian, thank you. That's a fantastic question. I really appreciate being able to join with you and appreciate the work that you're doing. So when I make an assessment, I sort of, and some of these things we've already said, but I look at sort of 3 layers. The first is this idea that there was a good start. And so why was there a good start? I think that one thing that was particularly important was, that effort of advocacy by John Wooten and my father. And so having champions with gravitas, with experience that folks really look to as role models in their industry, really embracing a diversity initiative in a meaningful way is very important. I think that's one thing we've learned. The second is that it did go beyond the NFL and really became somewhat of a North Star for industry in general. So even though across industry, we're nowhere near where I think any of us would like us to be, having something that's named, and I think, you see a lot of names go beyond Rooney, and they're folks of color, of different experiences. And I think my father would really appreciate that. But having sort of a North Star out there to move the conversation beyond football so those are 2 good markers. But then, as we said, in the NFL, there's no doubt that the last 5 to 7 years, it's been ineffective, and you can't, there's no reasonable way you can look at these numbers and say things have been going well. So I think owning the ineffectiveness of what has happened over recent times, looking backwards to see what had worked and see can we go back to some of those things, as well as looking forward, as Jeremi said, and what new tools, technologies, et cetera, are available for us to improve this. And then in terms of enforcement mechanisms, yes, I think that I think when you look at change in the long term, it's good to have some type of positive reinforcement. So how do we do that? But also making sure that there is some type of clear penalty and that folks know that, if they don't do this, that there will be some type of consequence. That I think is something that would be important for both the NFL as well as any other organization that's considering putting a rule of this nature into being.
So, Jeremi, following up on that, and you've spent most of your career working on this subject, so here's a question from some of our athletic directors from the A10 who helped plan this event. They ask, have we been bold enough? Do we need to take the foundation of the Rooney Rule and ratchet it up in new ways if we're really going to be successful and get concrete wins when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of programs and initiatives?
Great question, and I appreciate it. I think there are 2 things. I think one is in being bold, it is important, as I mentioned earlier, that we think about initiatives, other approaches, and that's part of being bold. But with respect to the Rooney Rule itself, we do need to be more bold, but I think everything is there to do it. So I think the foundation is strong. I think the boldness comes right where Jim left off, which is with respect to enforcement and penalty. It takes courage for the league to come down on a club that has not really complied with the rule. The last time that a club was actually deemed to have not complied with the Rooney Rule was 2003, almost a generation ago. And when that happened, there was a penalty of $200,000 issued to the then general manager of the Detroit Lions. And at the time, Commissioner Paul Tagliabue said the next violation will be met with a $500,000 penalty. Well, that was 2003, and now we're in 2020, and there have been, by most assessments, a handful, less than a half dozen, but a handful of circumstances where it appeared as though maybe the Rooney Rule was violated. I think the most notable was a few years ago with the Oakland Raiders head coach search. And in none of those handful of circumstances did the league conclude that a club had violated the rule. And in none of those circumstances did a club stand up and say, you know what, I didn't do this properly, or I made a mistake. And so the boldness is in the enforcement, in the league being willing to tell a club, you have done wrong, there must be a penalty that follows. And that's what we haven't seen in a decade and a half. So there's a space for boldness. I think boldness is necessary, but the bones of the rule are good. They're strong. Enforcement and penalty is where the boldness will come into play.
Jim, here's a question I've received from some of our Atlantic 10 student athletes. What would your father think about the Black Lives Matter movement today, especially as it relates to college and professional athletics? And would he support that movement, especially as it's been a central role for athletes as it relates to the dialogue in the movement?
So that's a great question. And there's sort of this underlying interesting point, and that is, we businessmen like to think of themselves as risk takers, but when it comes to so many social issues, they become, less willing to take risks. My father, I think, was the rare businessman that was an activist. Now, he was quieter than a lot of folks and spent much of his time, trying to build something like the Rooney Rule that went beyond, looked at a long-term solution, but he very much was an activist in ways that I think most business folks, don't step into that role. I think if you look at our players over the years in so many ways, and there's one great example right now, Tyrone Carter was a great safety of ours who went to the University of Minnesota, is heavily involved in the protest around George Floyd's murder, and has is in Minnesota doing this, and he has several times tweeted out how much he appreciated working for my father and my father's team because you are allowed to have your voice, and how much he appreciated how Dan Rooney specifically, encouraged players to have points of view, to use their voice, to step into challenging situations. So, I think the examples are pretty clear that was a place my father stood.
Here's a question for one or both of you, because you both mentioned this in talking about it, that the Rooney Rule has been applied outside athletics. And as we talked about, this whole program for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the A10 is meant to go beyond athletics across all of our campuses to talk about our universities more broadly and society more broadly. So can you talk a little bit about ways that you think business and higher education in specific and other areas outside athletics may have potential for further development in these areas in terms of pushing forward the Rooney Rule?
Jim, would you like, should I take that one?
Please.
The Rooney, one of the great things about sport is, when something happens in sport, a lot of people see it because a lot of people follow sport. And so the Rooney Rule has absolutely gotten traction outside of the National Football League and outside of athletics. And indeed, I should point out that before the NFL's Rooney Rule came to pass, I mentioned these lawyers earlier who were aggravated when Coach Dungy and Coach Green lost their jobs. Their idea, this diverse candidate slate idea, the idea that you should have a person of color on a slate for any opening, was something that they implemented in settlement agreements with corporations. So they litigated against a corporation. A settlement agreement came to pass. There were damages, but also systemic relief. And part of the systemic relief was that the organization would, going forward, when looking for somebody in the, you name the position, CEO or CFO or EVP or whatever it is, would include a candidate of color in the final interviewing slate. So that's what gave them the idea to even bring it to the league. And it was successful in that context. Now, the Rooney Rule came to pass. It became huge. Now other people began to see that this is an interesting initiative. And so other folks in other industries, and I mentioned some of them before, have adopted forms of the rule. Higher education as well. University of Texas a few years ago implemented a Rooney Rule for deans of colleges on up in the administrative structure. So it's gotten traction all over the place. But we don't have much in the way of data with respect to outcomes from these organizations that have passed the Rooney Rule, a Rooney Rule equivalent in the years since the NFL did it. And part of that is because, generally these are private organizations and they don't have to disclose. Anecdotally, just conversations that I've had of a few people in a few human relations departments at companies that have implemented the rule who have felt that it's not gone well at all. And this brings us back to the enforcement and penalty as I think about it, because it worked very well in those corporations that entered those court-approved settlement agreements that I mentioned as a consequence of litigation, because there was enforcement. The court had to review what was going on each year. When there isn't that sort of review, there isn't that sort of systemic enforcement, that sort of promise of a penalty, we don't know if we'll get the same sort of positive outcome. So I think the opportunity for all sorts of industries to benefit from the rule exists, but I think we go back to enforcement and penalty if we're going to actually get the benefit.
And it's interesting, my good friend and classmate from Harvard Law School, Professor David Wilkins, who you probably know, Jeremy, has been working on this for decades. And it's not just enforcement, but as you know, the business case for taking these steps is powerful. There is so much data now that businesses that do integrate into the operations diversity across the spectrum are far more successful. So there is a monetary business reason for doing this too. And I think that that's something business has learned actually probably more than higher ed and even athletics to a certain extent. Brian, what are you seeing in the chat there? Anything interesting?
Yeah, so we have a great question from one of our participants from the University of Massachusetts, and the question is, the Rooney Rule has been somewhat successful in interviewing at least one minority. However, it's not translated well into hiring more minorities. What could be changed about the Rooney Rule that would help more deserving minorities land successful jobs in the NFL?
Well, Jeremy talked a little bit about this. We've updated the rule this year, the NFL, to include 2 in the pool at the head coaching job. And all of the data indicates that if you have one candidate in the pool, although it was a great first measure, I believe, or at least a good first measure, you almost are reinforcing bias. So what organizations were doing, were saying, here's my final candidates and here's my minority candidate. When you increase that number by just 1, and if you do even more than that, it's an exponential. You go from, and Jeremy, maybe you know these numbers off the top of your head better than I, you go from somewhere between 5 to 8% to 40+% likelihood of hiring a minority candidate. So so even in that final candidate process, we're learning that these biases play out once again, and that people separate minority groups from non-minority groups if you're sort of give them an easy opportunity to do that. So increasing that final number in the pool, I think, is something that's really substantial to make those changes.
And let me ask you, Jeremy, because you're in higher ed, so you have a bird's eye view of this. And I saw some questions, and Andy from Washington, D.C., and also Aaron from George Washington University asking similar questions. But are there unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to universities hiring and their athletic departments providing real opportunities when it comes to coaches, athletic administrators that you've seen in your travels?
Yes and no. So I think the answer is yes, but there have been efforts made to combat it. So, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say I actually studied under Professor Wilkins, President Gormley. He was my professor, and I'm familiar with his work, and it is extraordinary. And just to comment on the end of what Jim said, I think that's exactly right. The two in the pool, but also if we can, as you were saying, if we can convince these entities that this really is good for you because it is good for them, the Wilkins argument, then I think we're going to have much more adoption. I mean, we have to convince them that by not thinking about this, you're actually acting irrationally. And so I think that, and that leads into to this question. There's been a strong movement in collegiate athletics, certainly. The state of Oregon, I don't think I mentioned previously, actually has a law. The state legislature passed a law that says that if you're looking for a head coach of any sport or an athletic director, you have to interview a candidate of color before you make the hire. So we've seen that effort. The West Coast Conference, as we see, has adopted what they call the Russell Rule, which is very similar to the Rooney Rule, and saying, that conference at their schools, at all of those schools in the conference, you have to interview a person of color before you ultimately make the hire. There's been a push for the NCAA to adopt a form of the rule. They've not done it, and some of the reasoning has had to do, at least as it's been articulated, with some of our schools are private schools, some of our schools are public schools. There might be other legal implications. In my view, I think that the Rooney Rule is something that the NCAA could lawfully call upon the presidents of institutions to agree to, and the presidents could, bind themselves. But there is an issue certainly on the collegiate level, and we're seeing different entities, one state, a conference, the NCAA as a whole, kind of taking different approaches as to how to crack the nut.
So I think one question that and this would be for you, Jim, as I think about, we mentioned changing the rule and having 2 minority candidates in the final pool, but I think it's really important to really talk about pipelines in these leadership positions, especially in athletics. How do you make sure that more minority candidates are in the pipeline to make sure that they're actually considered so they can get to, in the finalist number?
So another great question. So there's the obvious route, which is going further down the supply chain, if you will, using a Rooney Rule or a similar concept to make sure that at those levels that you're applying some intervention step around diversity. But there's also creative ways, and there's a lot of thinking around. In football, we know there was for so many years this terrible stereotype around black quarterbacks. And, fortunately that has changed in so many ways. And there's an idea of because the quarterback position becomes the quarterback coach becomes the offensive coordinator. And that's in football, the best pathway towards the head coaching job, going to some of the schools that have maybe are not there's less likelihood of those players getting to the NFL and getting some of the quarterbacks from those teams that are particularly African American young men, and getting them in the coaching pipeline earlier and actively recruiting. I know that's one concept that's out there that would address a very specific problem, and where there was a horrible example of structural racism that existed, in football for many, many years.
And Jim, you talk about really nicely in your book, I think it's worth saying something about your dad and his focus on HBCUs at the time to historically black colleges and universities as a recruiting ground for players at a time when that was not common at all.
No, and Bill Nunn, who grew up and lived, 3 minutes from your campus, can, really deserves the credit. I mean, it was part of my father's vision and plan, but Bill Nunn was the gentleman who, went to these schools, built these relationships. The story is that when Eddie Robinson would come to the great Grambling coach would come to Pittsburgh to recruit in Western Pennsylvania, he stayed at Bill Nunn's home. So, it was Bill Nunn who really, activated and brought that to reality. And it was, Bill is such a special part of our history. I think that one other point that we can bring, especially since we're talking to colleges and universities, and specifically some of the private colleges and universities, but I think this goes across the board, is, there is what we all believe a moral imperative that goes on these campuses. And my father grew up on Duquesne's campus, and I think he employed a high degree of emotional intelligence in how he approached decision making in general, and very specifically around hiring, and very more specifically around race in hiring. And I don't think we should dismiss the important role that universities have with that moral imperative, specifically to diversity, and specifically to diversity's relationship to opportunity and industry.
Yeah, that's a really nice point, Jim. And I want to just ask Jeremi, while we're talking about that, when you're talking about the kind of historical view of this, I do want to say a word about history here, Jeremi, because when Brian and I were on a call with commission members, including a bunch of ADs, a lot of people kept coming back to that question, well, has the Rooney Rule really taken us far enough, or has it been a failure? And I said to one young man who really raised a good point, it's so important to look at history, and you're a student of history as well, Jeremi, that I had the privilege of getting to interview Justice Thurgood Marshall when he was still alive, and he of course argued Brown v. Board of Education along with Charles Hamilton Houston, who you are well familiar with. Really, the person, Thurgood Marshall said to me, Charlie Houston really won that victory that integrated all public schools in the United States. Thurgood Marshall said he was carrying his bags. Well, if you would have asked whether Brown v. Board of Education was successful 15 years later in the 1970s, the early 70s, you would have said it's a failure. But look at the groundwork, and that's the biography of Charles Houston is called Groundwork, as you know. Look at the groundwork that they laid. So talk a little bit about that historical piece, because I think a lot of our younger students, especially who haven't had that exposure, don't understand how big the historical piece is if you're going to bounce from that to new things in this era that we're living in right now.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, it's important to recognize that the journey that's been traveled for African American coaches in the National Football League has been a long one. The first African American coach in the league was Fritz Pollard back in 1921. Somehow, speaking of history, during just an absolutely tumultuous and quite frankly bloody time in our nation when it came to race, this individual was able to become a head coach. It's hard to even understand how he was able to do it. Extraordinary individual. He's now in the Hall of Fame. There was not a head coach of color in the National Football League between Fritz Pollard in 1921 and Art Shell in 1989. We're talking about the better portion of a century there. There was no representation among head coaches. And after Art Shell got the job and did well, people thought that there was going to be a substantial increase in the number of head coaches. Well, that didn't happen. So we go another decade plus, and we're in the situation that I described when these two lawyers saw Dungy and Green fired and started the outside movement that merged with Dan Rooney's inside movement in the league to create the Rooney Rule. And so now we've had 15 plus years of the Rooney Rule. Some of those years very, very positive in terms of the growth of the numbers, and just the last few we've had a little bit of a drawback. So the first thing to say is this has been a long run, and the period of time the Rooney Rule has been in effect has been a short portion of that long run. So we put it historically, we see that the Rooney Rule hasn't been in effect for that long. But then secondly, the bulk of the time it's been in effect, it has been effective. I mean, we had a situation where there were 8 head coaches of color and 8 GMs of color not that many years ago. So what we really have to focus on is what's happened in these last few years. So I don't think we can call the Rooney Rule a failure as a historical matter or any matter really. What we have to point to, and this goes back to something, a theme of what we've been talking about, is enforcement and leadership, and how in the last few years we've moved away from the great successes, early successes of the Rooney Rule. So I don't think we can call it a failure. I think we have to call the rule an interesting initiative that has had success. And we have to now figure out why in the last few years, notwithstanding the rule, we've had some backsliding.
Ken, can I jump in?
Sure.
And Brian, if you guys are okay, back to this emotional intelligence, the empathy piece. I am glad, take the student side in your argument. I'm glad they're angry. My father was disturbed with what he saw. He lived almost all of those 70 years between Fritz Pollard and Art Shell. And you could say he could have done more, and he probably could have, although I think that, he really did pioneer a whole host of things that I sometimes pat him on the back for, but it was because he was aware and attuned to the humiliation, to just how dehumanizing it was to see these folks that he had grown up with, he had worked with, he had mentored, he helped improve their careers, to continually face these barriers when he knew, a guy like Tony Dungy was better than 90% of the people getting jobs. And so, I just think it's important to really, again, I'm reiterating this point, but that it's okay that people are angry because the disturbance is real. And my father experienced it. I think he tried to be proactive with it, but he didn't shy away from, that feeling of being upset by seeing something so wrong.
What a wonderful point too, Jim. And for people who don't know the story of your dad and your family, your dad, Dan Rooney, grew up on the north side of Pittsburgh at a time when Irish were often discriminated against in society. And he lived that, and he was very close to, he was a real person. I know that before he died, he was still hanging out with the ice ball snow cone guy there in the north side. The people, and he built Heinz Field a couple blocks away from his house because that was his community. And so he did have that understanding and intelligence, and I think that has to be part of this equation, and understanding that you get people who really understand other human beings is part of the secret of this. Brian, what else do you have there?
Yeah, so I want to go to Jeremi and President Gormley. You just talked about community, right? Jim, earlier you talked about relationships, and Jeremi, you mentioned the Fritz Pollard and what an inspiration he was for many head coaches right after him. And you had the honor of serving of counsel for the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which is a prominent and impactful organization. I want to talk about, are there strategic alliances that college athletics, in particular the Atlantic 10, should pursue to make sure that we can really establish like valuable partnerships to allow us to really bring about meaningful and impactful change?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian. I think it goes back to the old adage that we can do more together than we can do alone. And I think that when we've got a problem as big as the one we're dealing with, systemic racism generally, and discrimination, lack of equal employment opportunity when it comes to jobs in football, other sports, and other industries, it really is all hands on deck and all oars in the water. So absolutely, I think that strategic alliances are critical. The Fritz Pollard Alliance is doing its work. Mike Loxley's group, the head coach there, University of Maryland, he's got a group that basically is an umbrella organization for football coaches all the way from, pee-wee football all the way up to professional football. The idea being, let's all come together and figure out how to make the situation better. I actually serve on the Patriot League's, American Universities in the Patriot League, the Patriot League's anti-racism Anti-Racism Commission. I think, Patriot League and Atlantic 10 have a lot in common in a lot of different regards. I think synergies exist there. I think that, the West Coast Conference has done some interesting things. Both of our leagues should perhaps be in greater touch with them. The options, the opportunities to come together and work on this issue are many. And I think it's critical that we all do it, and we do it with an open heart. I mean, one of the things that was a challenge in the days that President Gormley mentioned, the 50s and the 60s, was that there were, as there have been in all movements, times when organizations have let small divisions create destroy synergy, essentially, and so we can't allow that to happen. I think that we all, from whatever perch we sit on, wherever we are, need to find ways to reach out to others such that we can, as a large community of individuals representing whatever organizations, individuals who care about equity and diversity and inclusion, work together to find a better way.
So we're down to our last question. Unfortunately, the time just flew by. But here's the question I want to ask both of you, because I really believe this is a special moment we're sitting in history. I've been now working on civil rights issues and teaching and studying in that area for my whole career, 40 years now. And I know both of you have been deeply enmeshed in this issue. And I really do think at this moment, as we're sitting here in 2020 with social unrest and protests and a growing sense that there is something wrong, that there is systemic racism that has to be addressed, that's universally, widely shared in this country, that we are at a moment right now, which is why we have this commission and why we're here to get some things done, to really do some different things. So, Dan Rooney was a visionary at the time he was working on this and in inventing what came to be known the Rooney Rule. So as you sit here, what would your big idea be, each of you? If you had the chance to say, okay, we're going to think as big as Jim's dad did, what would your big idea be here in 2020 at what I do think is a special moment? Jump ball.
I'll take the jump ball. I'm not sure who's taller between us. But I'll say, I would say that in thinking big, to me, and with respect to sports, to me, ownership is an issue. That there's just not a lot of diversity among ownerships in any of the major leagues in this country, and the barriers to entry for ownership are substantial. Of course, there's a vote that's involved of member clubs in all the different leagues, but also the financial barrier is extraordinarily high. In some leagues, it's the case that it's not just that a group has to have a certain amount of money, but that one person has to have a certain amount of money, and a huge amount. We're talking $800, $900 million for an NFL club. One individual has to have in order to buy in. So maybe thinking, outside of the box, maybe there's some way to alter some of these rules. There still have to be that amount of money to come in to actually buy the organization, but maybe one person doesn't have to have it. Maybe it can be spread around. Maybe there are other ways of sourcing and financing that would allow people who have, as a consequence of systemic discrimination over the course of generations since enslavement in this country, have not had the opportunity or the time to build up, substantial wealth. And so maybe that's, if we have more diversity in ownership, you don't always see that opportunity trickles down, but you often do. And I think if we had more diversity in ownership, we might see opportunity trickle down more than we're seeing now.
Great point, really interesting.
So, once again, I'll sort of rely on my father. It's the easy way out, but he did some things pretty well. When I think of that question, I think of two things that my father did. One, he was always willing to step into the mess, into the hard conversation, into the disagreements, have the empathy that I talked about, have perspective and an appreciation for suffering. but he also did talk to folks on the other side, if you will. You know, most of Western Pennsylvania is made up of white communities, and he went into those communities, and they really loved him for what he did with the Steelers, but he wasn't afraid to talk about race in those places. And he was one of the few people I've ever seen walk in and walk out with those conversations, and seemed to be loved on both sides of it. Clearly, I think there's indications we could say he didn't change everyone's mind, but I think we need to be willing to do that. He did it with strength, but he also did it with compassion. So I think that behaving from that standpoint is something I think we could all do more of. And that's a broad vision, but I think it's a worthwhile one. And then the larger one, when he was asked what ultimately he would like to see happen with the Rooney Rule, is he say, "I'd like to live in a world where there's no more need for a Rooney Rule." And I don't think we should ever lose sight of getting to the point where we all see each other based on merit and relationship, and not skin color or any other factor that might divide us.
A beautiful way to end things, because in the end it is about respectful, serious, meaningful conversations, right? That's what you're talking about, Jim. And where else to start that but on our university campuses, because it is our students and our young people and the people working in our college athletics who have the vision and the ability, the emotional strength, I think, to carry that out. And so I think that's a powerful message. I really want to thank you, Jim and Jeremi, for a fabulous gathering today. I want to also say thanks to my A10 co-chair, Brian Baptiste, for joining us. Great job, Brian. Also a special thanks to Bernadette McGlade, our A10 commissioner, and Jill Redmond, Senior Associate Commissioner of the A10, and all of the A10 member schools who participated today, and all of you tuning in to join us via live stream. I'm proud that Duquesne University was able to kick things off with this inaugural symposium. I hope we all were enriched by this conversation today. I know I really was, and I look forward to joining you for many more collaborative efforts with our A10 partner universities in the weeks and the months ahead, as our A10 Commission on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion moves forward with its important work, taking it beyond words to action. So thank you, and best wishes for a safe and healthy semester on all of your campuses.